Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank Farmers for Climate Action for inviting me here. I think, suppose I was reflecting a little bit, and it's just so important as our Mayor said, it's just farmers are on the front line of these changes that we're seeing. So we know that Australian farmers are some of the most adaptive in the world. They've had to be to deal with our variable climate, and that's going to continue. So I'd also like to thank Richard for his talk too, which I really think emphasised one of the real key issues is that climate change is going to be a stressor on all aspects. It might not be a direct link, but it's often going to be stressing some of those other aspects of the whole business. So a lot of my talk today comes from our biennial report that we put out, the State of the Climate report, with CSIRO, really examining those changes that we've seen in Australia's climate. And I was thinking today about what I want you to take away from this talk. So I suppose I'm giving the background of that base of why we're here. We're here because we've seen changes. Our climate is changing. And so today I'm going to be describing some of those physical changes that we've seen. And I'd really like you to take away from this that climate change is not like when we were kids or it's not something that's going to happen in 50 years' time or at the end of the century. It's something that's happening now and we're having to deal with now. Also, often in climate change, it's small numbers. We talk about a 1 degree temperature rise, but I'd really like you to take away from this presentation what impact that has on our extreme events. And extreme events are often the stresses, often what we have to deal with. So as we go through, I'll describe some of that. So this isn't how Australia's temperature or rainfall is changing, but just this slide here, and I know it's going to be talked about further on, but it's not just how it's affecting your on-farm business or how your rainfall's changing, it's how it's affecting the wider environment as well. So with banks looking to conduct scenario analysis to determine the potential impact. So you don't just want the bank saying what the physical changes on your farm is you want to be aware of what they're looking at. So who's talking to the Bureau about climate risk? So it's again, agriculture, one of the front line of that, but we're also talking to the energy sector, health, emergency services. So many industries are going to be impacted and affected by the changing climate. I wanted to talk a little bit about climate risk. So what do I mean when I talk about climate risk? And I've had a little bit of a think about this. And one of the stresses that we're going to see is those more frequent extreme events and more extreme events. So perhaps that heat wave that we haven't seen before and more frequent heat waves as well. So those impacts. Extreme events perhaps occurring where they haven't before. Your physical system might be geared towards a certain mean climate, towards a certain heat wave or heat that you might have, or rainfall that you might have received in the past. But what happens when you get, such as in Tasmania, when we get the heat down there, drying out some of those forests down there with the bushfires that we've seen. And also compounded extreme events. So like we've seen during this drought, especially over summer, dry conditions, heat wave conditions, and really impacting and on each other. So, and also multiple hazards occurring within a shortened time frame. So as Richard talked to, having to deal with those impacts and not having that recovery time. And also what we have seen with changing seasonality. So a little bit on impacts here. So Queensland flying fox species decimated by record heatwave. I included this just to link to that idea that there is sometimes a physical threshold that some systems, animals cannot handle. So when the temperatures got above a certain threshold, the flying fox species couldn't handle that and there was a mass death. That compound extreme event, so the agricultural minister that was in 2005, well below average rain for August and September, coupled with last week's heatwave decimated crop up in northwest Victoria. Melting bitumen leaves motorists sinking into Queensland Road, destroys tyres. That was I think in June or July. But just in terms of, again, not just your business, but also those things surrounding your business, such as transport, such as some of those other stresses, and also health, milk production. So how these extreme events are going to impact and change. This is to do with bushfire, but I just wanted to I think this really illustrates nicely that question, why do extremes matter? Why do these changes that we've seen matter? So with bushfires in Victoria, looking at the Forest Fire Danger Index, the cumulative index, so values associated with past severe seasons in the yellow and orange and red there. So we have a long-term average, the black line, and a changing average. So what happens if we have a time series, values associated with past severe seasons? We can see a couple of severe seasons, our 2009, the A283 Ash Wednesday, going into that severe zone. What happens when we put that on now that trend line? So with a trend, we now have values associated with past severe seasons. We can see that we're quite often getting into that severe zone now, every year, every 2 years, every 2 to 3 years. So again, not allowing that recovery time, not allowing and the impact that has on resources as well. So temperatures, a rise of 1.4 degrees Celsius in Australian land surface temperatures since records began in 1910, national gridded records. So Australia's climate has changed. Just a small picture on the side there. It has changed everywhere. It's warmed everywhere. And what does that mean though? 1.4 doesn't sound like a large number. It's a large number when we look at the impact on extreme events. So with that, Australia's climate has warmed just over 1 degree, leading to an increase in the frequency of extreme daily heat events. And this is one of my favourite graphs because I'm a scientist and I love graphs, but I think this is a really interesting one, and I apologise for the small writing, but just illustrating how that distribution changes, just that 1 degree shift in that distribution. So looking at the tails of that distribution, so off to the end there, just that one, so from 1951 to 1980 in that light green, so those very warm months that used to happen around 2% of the time, when we shift that distribution, that average, just by 1 degree, what happens to those extreme tails? It now, from 2004 to 2018, that instead of 2% of the time, it's now happening 15% of the time. So what happens when we move it further, when we move that further along, what happens to those tails then? So it's not just those averages, that average shift that we're concerned with, it's what's happening at that extreme tails. So in summer 2018, 2019, and again, I apologise for the smallness of this graph, but it was just, I suppose I've lost for words a bit because it was just, it was out of the park. We bet our previous record by around 0.8 degrees Celsius. So you can see it's up over 0.2 of an anomaly. So we can see our previous record, the summer of 2012, 2013, and just how much we were warmer than that. It was out of the park. So it's not going to be that steady progression of warmer and every year is warmer. It's just sometimes you might see those changes, sometimes you might see that really extreme shift. That's one of the threads too. This also highlights, it brings to mind, I just wanted to discuss the variability. So again, not every year is going to be warmer than the last. We have a highly variable climate in Australia, so we're still, with El Nino, La Nina, we're still going to get that variability in our climate. But what we might see what we do see that variability superimposed on a trend. So those La Nina years now might not be as cold or as wet as what they used to be, or as cold as what they used to be. So there is that trend to increasing temperatures. So a new record for the hottest summer, 0.9 degrees hotter than the previous record. So just amazing. So we've got a graph there of some really hot temperatures that were experienced around the country, some record temperatures. I've just put in there as well 4 consecutive days above 40 degrees at Canberra. So I think previously they'd only had maybe 9 days above 40 degrees in their history, but 4 consecutive days above 40 degrees. So just illustrating, again, that there's, where you are, where you're situated, the previous physical systems may not be set up to cope with these sorts of changes that we're seeing. So with extreme events and attributing extreme events to climate change, we talk about the frequency of, so climate change has made this, perhaps made this event more frequent, and it has perhaps made this event, or it has made this event more intense. So this is from the 2016 State of the Climate report, where national daytime temperatures were record-breaking in spring 2014, which still would have happened even if you didn't have climate change, but with climate change in there, those temperatures were made more intense. And I just pulled out an example here, so from the newspaper, how climate change is affecting what we grow and eat. A really good article that I saw on the ABC News. So one farmer, but there is one measurement that illustrates it all too well, days over 35 degrees Celsius. And so this farmer, Mr. Whip, says there's a noticeable increase in days over 35. And the reason that's important is because once you get over 35 degrees, that's when the temperature starts to make an impact on cattle. They don't want to eat as much. By 40 degrees, their intake of dry matter can drop up to 50%. And then it goes on to highlight some management strategies. He's destocked his farm, changed breeding and put other measures in his place. For example, he's ready with high energy supplements. So I thought, well, so I went to the Longreach area. Is he experiencing more days over 35? Well, yes, there is a trend. He is seeing more days over 35 and he is seeing more days over 40 degrees. I suppose I want to emphasise too, not every year is a bad year. Perhaps I originally had that pointing to 2010, but perhaps that's not the best example because that's when they saw a lot of floods, perhaps through the region. But yeah, taking advantage of those years that are not extreme and managing for those extreme events. So moving on from temperature now to rainfall. So Southern Australia is drying. We're seeing a drying trend in Southern Australia, and we're seeing that at similar latitudes around the world on all those west-facing land areas. So in southwest WA, which is the top time series there, you can see a shift since around the 1970s. So this is for April to October rainfall. They get most of their rainfall from frontal systems through that time of the year. And there's been that shift south in those frontal systems and they've had a decrease in rainfall. In southeastern Australia, in the bottom panel there, there's been a similar decrease around the 90s. We do get a rainfall from more sources than what southwest WA does. I've put in here, I must admit I wasn't expecting this. This was an example from just the local rainfall district, the local Bureau rainfall district, a similar time series, April to September. This is what we've been tracking for the drought, the recent drought in the wider region. So you could see, and the last one, the 2019 value is for April to August. So even though it's the lowest at the moment, that could go up with September rainfall. But just seeing, again, there seems to be a similar shift towards a typically below average rainfall in the recent period, also encompassing the Millennium Drought, and with a couple of wet years in there, but tending towards that below average rainfall. And I'll just, I suppose, highlight in terms of the context of the current drought, looking at those 2 years, well, and probably 3 years together now. But looking back in the history, there hasn't been those 3 years together that have been as bad, as severe. So going on, so droughts are also getting warmer. So what we're seeing there, so with the lighter coloured dots, higher temperature, or the more recent period, so, and with higher temperatures and with lower rainfall. So how is that impacting on the nature of drought in the Murray-Darling Basin? So I wanted to have a quick look to the future, and I know my colleagues will be looking at this further, but we'll need to, these are near future changes. So we can see the time series of Australian temperatures going up there in the grey and that is modelled by our climate models, and all scenarios for future climate change out to 2030, they don't diverge because of what's already in the system. So we're going to have to adapt. No matter what emissions path we take, we're going to have to adapt to future changes that are already locked into the system. So going forward, there's going to be more changes. Where we can make a difference is deciding on the future what path we want to be on. Do we want to be, I'd say we don't want to be on that high path, that high business as usual path, which we're currently on. We want to be on one of those lower paths that gives us is perhaps more manageable for the future. So with the middle red box there, hard to see, but that's 2013, Australia's hottest year on record. It wasn't just our hottest year on record because it was a little bit hot. It was our hottest every day. It was our hottest year on record. We had multiple heat waves, record high temperatures. If you take that down, if you dash that across, that's in our low emissions or below average in our medium emission scenario. So which is one of the scenarios we're aiming for, around 1 degree on that graph for Australia. So when you hear about Paris talking 2 degrees and aspirational 1.5 degrees, I'd like you to keep in mind, again, what I've talked about, how that 1 degree shift influences extreme events, and also keeping in mind how this graph and how that impacts on Australians' climate and temperature. My colleague will be going further into this, so I'll skip this. But just briefly, we have scenarios, so you can look ahead to see what your climate or what might be like in the future, what area of Australia might have a similar climate to what you might be experiencing in the future. And I'll stop it there. Thank you.